for more on the situation. Yvonne Dege, regional spokesperson for East and Horn of Africa at the UN's Migration Agency, the International Organization for Migration, joins us now. Welcome to the programme, Yvonne.
Thank you, Millicent.
Paint a picture of how real this risk of famine approaching the Horn of Africa is in the coming months due to the severe drought.
Well, Millicent, the situation facing millions of people in the Horn of Africa is extreme, to say the least. They lack access to water. They lack access to food. This is creating food insecurity. We're seeing heightened levels of malnutrition and hunger. And as a consequence of that, thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced as they search for pasture, if they're farmers, and for many, trying to leave the region to find places where they can get refuge and get humanitarian assistance. The lack of the rainfall is also leading to heightened fears about insecurity. As you can imagine, there is now competition for the very scarce resources available in the region. And we see this situation affecting countries like Kenya, where I'm speaking to you from, but also Somalia and Ethiopia. In Somalia, we know that they are seeing a drought, the likes of which they have not seen for 4 decades, 40 years. We've seen thousands of Somalis leave the country, trying to cross the border to Ethiopia to find refuge there, humanitarian assistance and resources. And this is leading obviously to widespread concerns about, if this situation is not urgently addressed, what will be the situation facing these individuals. IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and other UN agencies estimate that at least 15 million, though it could rise to even 20 million people, are going to be affected by this ongoing humanitarian crisis. And it's been driven by some of the issues mentioned in your intro there. The lack of the rainfall leading to drought, that obviously has a connection to the climate change situation. And of course, it is creating vast competition for resources amongst some of the world's most vulnerable people here in the Horn of Africa.
And is migration or moving elsewhere even an option for those who want to flee or who can avoid the hunger and save their lives?
Well, we're already seeing vast numbers of people, as I said, moving from Somalia in particular to Ethiopia. Some of those are farmers and they're looking for pasture for their livestock. We've already seen millions of livestock dead because of the drought. And some are taking the dangerous migratory route from the Horn of Africa, that's countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, and Djibouti, to try to cross over to the Gulf nations of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. Many cross and have been crossing since the onset of this crisis across the Gulf of Aden from the coast of Djibouti, hoping to get to countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, like I said, but having to pass through a war zone. So we're seeing vast numbers of people displaced. And the concerning thing for IOM, the International Organization for Migration, is what the impact will be of this forced displacement. We're seeing increased levels of people being the victims of trafficking and smuggling. You can imagine when people are desperate to leave a situation and to escape the drought and the looming famine, they're often the target of people traffickers and smugglers. So there are 2 migratory options for people. One is to just simply try to cross borders, which we're seeing, which is obviously also leading to higher levels of insecurity as there is that competition, as I say, for resources between the communities who are arriving and the host communities. And then those, mainly young people, women, and sometimes children, taking the dangerous eastern route from the Horn of Africa to Djibouti, across the Gulf of Aden, to try to reach Gulf countries.
My earlier guest talked about the, war invasion in Ukraine and how it's affecting skyrocketing prices. But then how much of this drought and what's happening at the Horn and East Africa is as a result of climate change and then COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, first on Ukraine, Millicent, we are seeing a connection to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine in the sense that the fuel prices have skyrocketed. And for many of these people, especially farmers and agriculturalists, they rely on cheaper fuel. And we've seen globally the cost of fuel increasing. We've also seen supply chains, global supply chains disrupted. In some of the countries mentioned, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, they do depend on some imports from Russia and from Ukraine. In terms of climate change, as I said earlier, climate change is one of the root causes of what we're seeing. And what we have seen because of the drought, as I said, Somalia, it is 4 decades, 40 years since they've seen the kind of drought that they're experiencing today. And as a result of that, what the evidence shows us is that much of this drought and changing climatic situations is being caused by increasing climate change. And we're seeing it worsen because, of course, as people move and compete for resources and land, the situation worsens. So there is a clear link between some of the situation that we see going on in Ukraine and in Russia, and of course, what we see happening here in the region vis-a-vis the climatic changes that are forcing many people to uproot their lives, to leave home, to look for greener pastures, literally for livestock, which is leading and fueling a worsening humanitarian situation, which we see manifesting in communal conflict, competition for resources, et cetera, et cetera.
And some would call this a post-COVID-19 era. Is that in any way also impacting this situation?
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has had different effects in the region. At the onset of the pandemic, of course, with all the borders closed, it was extremely difficult for many people in the region to try to migrate, to try to move. But with the relaxation of border controls and the introduction of a COVID-19 vaccine, we have seen increasing numbers of people trying to move. And our concern as IOM, the International Organization for Migration, is that in that desperation to move, the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic has obviously been devastating for millions of people. People are choosing irregular means to move. They're not using formal channels. And as a consequence of that, what we anticipate and what we're concerned about as the IOM is that more people will become the target of traffickers and smugglers and unfortunately die along the way. And we have seen that since the beginning of the pandemic. In 2020, towards the end, and 2021, at least 100 people were killed, mainly young Ethiopians trying to reach the Gulf of Aden to cross over to the Middle East. And we've seen various other examples of women and children being targeted in this way in their attempts to move, simply seeking a better life.
Yvonne, I'm thinking solutions. What can be done to avert this disaster? I mean, there have been calls for more funding. How much is needed now? And will it provide temporary relief or something lasting?
Good question, Millicent. So the UN collectively is appealing for $4.4 billion just to address the looming humanitarian crisis in this region. That is to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance. I'm talking about the basics: food, water, shelter, medical care, psychosocial support and counseling, because as you can imagine, many of these people are traumatized, their lives have been completely disrupted, and they can't see any solution or any end in sight to the situation they're facing. So the appeal that has been issued by the UN agencies, which I say comes to around $4.4 billion, will address some of the urgent needs, emergency response. But ultimately, there is a component and an element of the funding that is being required, which will be targeted towards looking at the drivers and the root causes of the drought and the displacement we are seeing. Obviously, climate change is not an issue that can be tackled alone by individual countries alone. It has to be done collectively. COP27 is coming up towards the end of the year in Cairo, where the UN and other partners hope to have the issues facing people in the Eastern Horn of Africa around drought addressed, but also working with host communities and national governments to try to find sustainable development solutions so that when situations like the one the region is facing now do occur, the instinct of people is not to immediately try to up and leave. And that involves obviously looking at agricultural issues, reduction of imports, et cetera, employment, which is a huge driver, or the lack of employment, which is a huge driver of migration, and trying to address the socioeconomic issues that compel people to up and leave.
Yvonne and Dege, we really hope that things get better, really hope and pray. Thank you so much. She is the regional spokesperson, East Horn of Africa, UN's migration agency, IOM. Thank you for joining us again.